The Greyhound bus groaned to a halt in the dust and heat of the small Texas town, its air brakes hissing a tired sigh. For Sarah, the sound was the final, definitive thud of a closing door. She stepped off, the late afternoon sun a heavy hand on her shoulders, and surveyed Main Street. It was a single, sun-bleached ribbon of pavement lined with stores that seemed to have been frozen in a 1950s time capsule. A hardware store, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a feed store, and the sprawling dusty ghost of a hotel that had long since seen its glory days. This was it. This was where her grandmother had grown up. This was the place that held the answers she'd been running from and towards her entire life. In her hand she clutched a worn leather pouch, heavy and solid. Inside were $3,000 in crumpled, slightly faded bills. The wedding money. It had been given to her by her grandmother, Elizabeth, on the eve of Sarah's wedding to a man named David, a fine, stable, utterly predictable man her parents adored. The money was meant to be a down payment on a sensible house in a sensible suburb, the beginning of a sensible, ordinary life. But 3 days before the wedding, Sarah had felt the walls of that life closing in around her. She'd looked in the mirror and seen not a bride, but a stranger wearing a white dress. A stranger who was about to commit to a future that felt as suffocating as a perfectly wrapped gift. She had packed a single bag, taken the money, her grandmother's hope for her future, and fled. She ran not from David. She had tried to convince herself, but towards something else. Something she didn't yet have a name for, but something she knew she needed to find. A frantic phone call to her grandmother, filled with tears and apologies, had calmed her. Elizabeth hadn't been angry. She'd sounded instead like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Come back to me, darling," she'd said in that soft, weathered voice. "Come back to the ranch. Your grandfather and we need your help." The urgency in her tone had surprised Sarah. Elizabeth had always been a pillar of stoic strength. Sarah had packed a small bag and, as always, followed her grandmother's whispered advice. That had been 3 weeks ago. The journey from Chicago to this forgotten corner of Texas had been a long, winding road of introspection and regret. Now, she stood here, the money a heavy burden in her hand, and looked for the man her grandmother had mentioned. Her grandfather, Henry, had passed a decade ago, and Elizabeth had run the ranch herself, with a fierce independence that had always secretly inspired Sarah. But now she was 82, and the year's drought had been ruthless. She'd said she needed help, and she'd said the man who could help was to meet her. Sarah had expected an old ranch hand, maybe a grizzled veteran who'd worked with her grandfather. A sound made her turn. A tall figure unfolded itself from the shade of the hardware stall's awning, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that spoke of a deep connection to the land. He wore a worn Stetson, low on his brow a faded denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and tanned a deep, leathery brown. His jeans were dusty, his boots worn, and his face was a landscape of sun and wind weathered, handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. He was older than her, mid-30s maybe, and there was a stillness in his eyes, a patient, watchful calm that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. She knew who he was before he spoke. This was Cole. Her grandmother had spoken of him with a fondness in her voice that Sarah had noted but not questioned. He was a neighbor, a rancher who had helped Elizabeth through many a tough season. He stopped a few feet away, tipping his hat just slightly. "Sarah." His voice was a low drawl, smooth as river stones. "Yes." She held up the money pouch, feeling utterly foolish. "I'm here to return this. I believe you're the man my grandmother said would take it for the ranch. She said you could help. I don't want it. I never should have taken it." He didn't take the pouch. Instead, he tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Your grandmother told me you were coming. She said you had a question to ask me, too, though. I have a feeling it's not one you want to ask." Sarah blinked. A question. She said you had a conversation a long time ago, when you were a little girl. He looked at her with those steady, unfathomable eyes. You asked her why my daddy married my mama. The air seemed to still. The memory crashed over her, vivid and sharp, like a photograph from a dusty album. She had been maybe 12, visiting the ranch for the summer. Her grandmother, for all her deep, abiding love, had always been a closed book about the past. But Sarah, a curious and headstrong girl, had been asking questions. She remembered asking about Cole's parents, a couple she'd seen in a faded, sepia-toned photo on the mantel. They seemed like such an improbable match. His mother, a delicate, dark-eyed woman with a sad smile, and his father, a stern, thick-shouldered man with a face like granite. Why did he marry her? Young Sarah had asked, her voice high and curious. Elizabeth had been quiet for a long time, her hands stilling in her lap. Finally, she'd said he asked her one question, honey, just one, and it changed everything for them. The answer to that question can be the most powerful thing in the world. It has to be. It was for them. She'd looked at Sarah with a strange, knowing glint in her eye. You'll ask him that question one day, when you're ready to hear the answer. Sarah had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman, a piece of Southern folklore, but the memory of the question had haunted her. I don't remember what the question was, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. You will, Cole said, when you're ready to hear the answer. He held his hand out, not for the pouch but for her small, battered suitcase. Come on, he said, his voice softening a fraction. Let's get you out of this heat. We've got a lot of work to do, and your grandmother is waiting. She's got a story to tell you, too. The old ranch truck rattled along a dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that painted the late afternoon sky a hazy ochre. Sarah sat beside Cole, the money pouch still clutched in her lap like a shield. She watched the landscape unfold, a vast undulating sea of brown and gold. It wasn't the lush, ordered countryside of her childhood. It was raw, rugged, and untamed. It looked like a place where a person could easily get lost, both physically and spiritually. A drought, she said, breaking the silence. She'd been told about it by her grandmother, but seeing the land was different. It was a heart-wrenching sight. Creeks were dry, their beds cracked and parched. The cattle she occasionally saw were thin, their ribs visible. It was a land holding its breath. The worst in 50 years, he confirmed. It's hard on everyone. Hardest on the ones who love it the most. People like your grandmother. He glanced at her. She's a fighter, but she's tiring. I've spent the last 5 years climbing the ladder in a sleek corporate office, Sarah confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I thought I had it all figured out. The apartment, the car, the perfect fiancé. I was building this life, this beautiful glass tower, but it felt empty, like I was just going through the motions. I couldn't breathe. Sometimes the walls you build to protect yourself end up being the walls that keep you trapped, he said, his voice quiet. His words hung in the air, a simple truth that struck her with unexpected force. They drove in silence for another 10 minutes before he turned onto a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient live oaks, their leaves a silvery green. At the end of it stood a sprawling, weathered ranch house. It was a beautiful old structure, built of stone and wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It looked both imposing and welcoming. As the truck rolled to a stop, the screen door of the house creaked open. A small, silver-haired woman stepped out. She was dressed in simple pants and a plaid shirt, and despite the years etched into her face, there was a fierce, indomitable spark in her eyes. It was Elizabeth. Sarah jumped out of the truck, forgetting the money, forgetting the strange question, and ran to her grandmother. She threw her arms around the older woman, holding her tight. "Grammar," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For running. For everything." "Hush now, child," Elizabeth said, patting her back with a surprisingly firm hand. "There's nothing to be sorry for. You came home. That's all that matters. Cole, thanks for bringing her. Come on in, both of you. Supper's almost ready." The inside of the house was a warm embrace of old wood and fading floral prints. The air smelled of dust, sun, and a faint, sweet scent of lavender. Elizabeth shooed them to the kitchen, a large, welcoming room where a pot of chili simmered on the stove. The three of them sat down at the worn oak table, the centerpiece of Elizabeth's world. Over a simple meal of chili and cornbread, Elizabeth's eyes were sharp and clear, her gaze moving from Sarah to Cole and back again. "So," she began after a long silence, "I hear you two have a question and an answer to discuss." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "Grammar, I asked Cole a silly question. Something you told me about his parents. It doesn't matter." "It does matter," Elizabeth said, her voice surprisingly firm. "It matters more than you know. You didn't ask it when you were a little girl. You asked it the minute you picked up the phone to run. You just didn't know it yet." Cole, who had been quietly eating his chili, looked up. "Sarah, you are here to return the money, which is a very honorable thing. But Elizabeth is right. There's something else you came to do. Something you came to ask." He put down his spoon, his eyes fixed on hers. "Ask me." Sarah felt a strange pressure in her chest. She looked from her grandmother's knowing face to Cole's earnest one. The memory of that childhood conversation came back, clear as a bell. The photograph of the mismatched couple. The quiet weight in her grandmother's voice. The question, simple and profound. "All right," she said, her voice trembling. "I came here to ask you," she swallowed, the words feeling huge and heavy. "Why did your father marry your mother?" The room was completely silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. Cole didn't flinch. He looked at her with those same steady eyes, and his expression softened into something that looked almost like relief. He took a long, slow breath, and a question seemed to hang between them, shimmering in the air. "My father was a hard man," Cole began, his voice low. "The kind of man who took the land and the work more seriously than any person. He was my grandfather's son, and my grandfather was a cattle baron who ran his ranch and his family like a military operation. My father had no patience for anything that wasn't practical, anything that didn't turn a profit. My mother was the exact opposite. She was a dreamer. She came from the East, from a family of artists and musicians. She had this voice like a thrush, and she used to sing while she worked in the garden. My father met her at a town dance. He was a big, awkward man who didn't know how to dance, and she, this delicate creature, took his hand and taught him. She was the only one who ever saw the man behind the mask. She saw a man who, for all his coldness, was desperately lonely. They courted for 6 months," he continued. "My grandmother, a good and kind woman, was delighted. She thought my mother was the best thing that could ever have happened to him. But my grandfather, he was furious. He thought it was a fool's match. He told my father in no uncertain terms that he was ruining the family name, that a soft, Eastern woman had no place on a cattle ranch. He said she'd be dead or ruined within a year. So my father had a choice. To listen to his father, the man who had raised him to be hard and unyielding, or to follow his own heart. And you have to understand, my father's heart was a closed, locked vault. No one had ever been given a key, but my mother had one. She'd found it and unlocked it, and for the first time in his life, he knew what he wanted. It didn't come naturally to him. He was a man of duty, of obligation. It was all he knew, but she changed that." Cole paused, his eyes now distant, looking back at a memory he'd probably never shared with anyone but his grandmother. It was late one night, just a week before the wedding was supposed to happen. He came to my grandfather's study. My grandfather was sitting there, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the firelight casting long shadows. My father, my big, stoic, unreadable father, didn't plead. He just stood there, and he asked my grandfather just one question. Cole's gaze met Sarah's. His eyes were blazing. He asked him, "Do you love her?" Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the question. It was the answer she'd been waiting for her whole life. Cole continued, his voice soft but powerful. My grandfather, this old, hard man, looked at his son for a long time. He saw a reflection of himself. He saw the life he could have had, the love he had given up for the sake of duty and land. And he saw the fear in his son's eyes, not the fear of losing his inheritance, but the fear of losing her. My father, this quiet, stubborn man, stood his ground. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stood there and asked with all his heart, "Do you love her?" The words hung in the air, heavy with a silent answer. His father's answer was as simple as the question. Cole said. He didn't say no. "I think she's wrong for you." He didn't say, "You're making a mistake." He looked at his son, and he saw something he'd never seen before. He saw a man who was no longer a boy, a man who had found something worth fighting for. And he said, "Yes, son, I see that you do." And he gave his blessing. He said my mother was a good woman, and he was proud of my father for having the courage to stand up for what he wanted. He had been wrong about her. He had been wrong about everything. Silence. The enormity of Cole's words hung between them. Sarah felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She looked at her grandmother, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears. She looked back at Cole. The answer to the question wasn't about his parents at all. It was about her. She was running. Not from David, not from the wedding, but from the life she had been told to want. She had been so terrified of making the wrong choice, of disappointing everyone, that she had forgotten to ask herself the most important question of all. The question she had been running from her whole life. "Grammar," she whispered, her voice broken. "Why didn't you ever tell me the whole story?" I know he was a hard man, but his question, it's the same one I couldn't ask. It's the question I've been too scared to answer my entire life. Elizabeth reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. Her touch was warm and surprisingly strong. "Because I couldn't answer it for you, honey," she said gently. "I couldn't give you the answer. That was something you had to find for yourself, just like Cole had to find it for himself." "Find what?" Sarah asked, the question a raw, desperate plea. "The answer to the question that changes everything," Elizabeth said, her voice deep and wise. "The question that isn't about what you owe to other people, or what you think you should want. It's the question you ask yourself when you're standing at a crossroads, with nothing but the truth ahead of you. My mother taught it to me, and I taught it to Cole's mother. And now it's your turn. It's not a question you hear. It's a question you live." Cole leaned forward, his gaze holding hers. "What are you afraid of, Sarah?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. It was the question she had run from. The question she had buried under a perfect job, a perfect fiancé, a perfect life. The question that had no answer. "I'm afraid of failing," she said, the words tumbling out. "I'm afraid of choosing the wrong thing, of ending up alone, of being a disappointment." "That's not the real question," Cole said, his voice unwavering. "That's fear. The question is, what do you want? Not what you think you should want, not what others want for you, but what does your heart want?" Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotion. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But the truth, the simple, terrifying, liberating truth, was clawing its way to the surface. She looked at her grandmother, a woman who had lived her life with a quiet, unshakable strength. She had lost her husband, weathered droughts, and still she stood. She hadn't just endured life. She had lived it. Sarah looked at Cole. He was a man who had faced the same fears, the same doubts. He had asked the same question, and the answer had led him here to this dusty ranch, to this beautiful house, to this conversation with a woman he barely knew but felt inexplicably connected to. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of hard work. He wasn't afraid of the desert. He wasn't afraid of her. She saw her answer. It was as simple and profound as the question. "I don't want to be a stranger in my own life," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "I don't want to wake up in 20 years married to a man I barely know, in a house I don't love, wondering where the time went. I want to be here, with you, with grammar. I want to learn the land, and the work, and the struggle. I want to build something that's real and true. I don't have to be rich. I don't have to be impressive. I just want to be happy." Cole didn't move. He just looked at her, his eyes holding a universe of understanding. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and strong. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then you're already on your way." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about David. It was about a question, an answer, and a choice that would define the rest of her life. She looked at the money pouch, still sitting on the table. She slid it across the table to Cole. "I don't need this," she said. "I don't want it. I want this." He took the pouch, but he didn't put it away. Instead, he opened it, and for a moment she thought he was going to count the money. Instead, he reached inside and pulled out an old, faded photograph, the same one she'd remembered from her grandmother's mantel. It was a picture of Cole's parents, the mismatched couple. They were standing in front of this very house, his father's arm around his mother's shoulders. His father was looking down at her, his stern face transformed by a soft, loving expression. His mother was looking up at him, a radiant smile on her face. They were strangers. They were different, but they had chosen each other, and they had been happy. Sarah looked from the photograph to Cole, and she knew that the answer to the question she had finally asked was right here. She could have it all. She could have the love, the struggle, the joy, and the pain. She could have a life that was truly her own. She took Cole's other hand. She didn't have to say anything. The words were in the air, hanging between them, as powerful as any promise. She came to return the wedding money, but she found the one question that had been waiting her whole life. And it changed everything. The next day, Sarah woke before dawn. The light was just beginning to streak across the sky, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. She slipped out of bed and padded to the window. Cole was already out there, moving with a quiet purpose, checking on the horses, his figure a dark silhouette against the growing light. She felt a peace she had never known. The fear was still there, a low hum in the background, but the question was no longer a terrifying unknown. It was a compass, pointing her towards home. She wasn't running anymore. She was home. And she knew, with a certainty that warmed her from the inside out, that the answer to the question she had found was just the beginning of a beautiful, terrifying, and wonderful life. She pulled on her boots and walked out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dust and hay. Cole saw her and walked over. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft. He pointed towards the distant hills. "The well's dry," he said. "We need to dig a new one. It'll be hard work." She looked at the dry land, at the hills that seemed to go on forever, and then at him. She didn't feel dread. She felt a sense of purpose, a thrill of excitement. "I know," she said, "but we'll do it together." For the first time in her life, Sarah didn't need a perfect plan or a predictable future. She had found the question that changed everything, and the answer was simpler than she could have ever imagined. It was love. It was home. It was the courage to choose. And that was more than enough.